In this video, you're going to get introduced to JavaScript. So what is JavaScript? JavaScript is a programming language which is used mainly for the web. You will find it usually embedded in HTML code to add more complex things to web pages than showing a static page. JavaScript can be used to add animations to the web page. It can also make the web page interactive by responding to user actions like clicking on a button. It can do some other things like validating forms before sending data to a server, or even making asynchronous calls to the server and loading data without refreshing the page, which creates a fluid user experience. JavaScript used to be restricted to the browser, but it is no longer the case. Now it is also commonly found running standalone on the server under Node.js. Now that you've been introduced to JavaScript, let's have a quick look at some JavaScript frameworks which you'll be able to learn after this course. A framework is a JavaScript library which comes with pre-built code which you can use off the shelf to add functionalities to your projects. Now there are many JavaScript frameworks available. We're going to have a quick look at the top ones. AngularJS is a framework which was used to build websites like PayPal, The Guardian, Freelancer.com, and more. React is another top framework used by Facebook, Instagram, and more. Node.js. This one is a server-side JavaScript runtime which is used by PayPal, Groupon, and many others. Now you need a comprehensive and solid understanding of JavaScript before learning any of those frameworks. And this is exactly what this comprehensive JavaScript course is going to equip you with. Now, as we said earlier, JavaScript can be used both in the front end, meaning on the client side, and in the back end, meaning the server side, like when you work with Node.js. Now, this course will focus only on the client-side usage of JavaScript. Now, if you work with JavaScript in the browser, you will need to learn a few concepts. So let's go through them one by one. ECMAScript, the document objects model, and the browser objects model. So let's start with ECMAScript. ECMAScript is a standard for JavaScript. It comes with a specification of JavaScript features and how developers should implement them. So let's look at one example. So if you look at this line of code, you can see that we are declaring a variable x and initializing its value to 1. Now you don't have to worry about the syntax. This is something you're going to learn in the next chapter. But just to understand what ECMAScript is going to provide us with a specification telling us things like what keywords we need to use in our code. In our case, the keyword var to declare a variable, what syntax we need to use, how to use the semicolon at the end of our statement, operators, how to use the equal sign, and more. So this is what ECMAScript is. Now, where does the name come from? Well, ECMA stands for European Computer Manufacturers Association. Basically, JavaScript was originally created at Netscape, and they wanted to standardize the language, so they submitted the language to ECMA. Now, there was a trademark problem with the name JavaScript, so that's why they called the standard ECMAScript. That's all. Now, ECMAScript is a standardization not only of Netscape's JavaScript, but of other scripting languages. We'll explain later what a scripting language is. So the purpose of the standard was that all browsers can understand instructions written using ECMAScript. So these scripting languages or dialects, they support code written before the standardization into ECMAScript, and they also provide some features which are not available in ECMAScript. Now, ECMAScript has got many versions. So you'll hear about ES5, ES6, ES4, which was abandoned, and other ones. Now, ES5 was standardized in 2009, but new features were introduced in ES6, which is also referred to as ECMAScript 2015. Now, implementation of these features in different JavaScript engines are still underway. Now let's understand what a scripting language is. A scripting language is an interpreted language. This means that it doesn't need to be compiled. Okay, what does it mean? Well, if you pick C++ or Java and you write code in any of these languages, your code will need to be compiled by a compiler and converted to machine code. Machine code is the language that can be understood by your computer. And this is a very low level of code and consists entirely of numbers. And this is what your computer is able to understand. So these languages need to be compiled. Now if you pick JavaScript, normally JavaScript doesn't need to be compiled. That's why we call it a scripting language. So the JavaScript engine is going to interpret the JavaScript code into tasks to be executed straight away by the browser. So we don't have to compile the language into machine code or anything like that. We can straight away just interpret the code into macro tasks. So this is a higher level compared to that one. Now, JavaScript may be compiled in some cases, especially in modern JS engines. So in some modern engines, you will find something called JIT compilers. JIT stands for just in time. So these compilers, they will compile your code straight away just before execution of your JavaScript code. And it will be converted to a compiled code before the execution of your code. So this is something to bear in mind. So normally JavaScript is a scripting language, but in some modern JavaScript engines, you will find JIT compilers or just-in-time compilers inside the JavaScript engine, and they will compile your code into machine code before execution. Now you may be asking, what's the difference between JavaScript that is compiled and JavaScript that is interpreted? Well, modern JavaScript engines, they introduce the compilers or the JIT compilers for optimization reasons. Basically, if your code is compiled, it's actually more optimized than if your code is just interpreted. That's something to bear in mind. And just a quick clarification here, the JavaScript engine is embedded to your browser and is responsible for the execution of your JavaScript code. Now let's move to the DOM, or the Document Object Model. The DOM is a programming interface for HTML and XML documents. So if you look at this web page, you can see that it's made of different components like this paragraph, this picture, that title, and so on. So the DOM is going to represent our web page so that programs like JavaScript can access the different elements of the web page and change them. So JavaScript can change the content, the styling, and so on. So if we break down the different components of the web page like this, so inside the HTML elements, you'll find the head and the body, and this applies to any web page. Then inside the head, you will find the meta elements, the title, which you can see right there. The meta elements usually just includes information about the web page, which can be used by search engines and so on. And in the body, you'll find all the visible elements like this paragraph, that image, and also any scripts that you may have. Usually JavaScript is going to go right there. Sometimes you'll find scripts in the head element, but usually they go at the end of the body element. So JavaScript will access these elements as nodes or objects. And this is something we will cover in detail later on in the course. So now you just need to remember that the browser will provide a DOM interface. So this interface will allow ECMAScript to interact with the DOM. So this is why JavaScript can access all those elements and change them. Now let's move to the BOM, or the browser object model. So this describes methods and interfaces for interacting with the browser itself. So this includes things like showing an alert message in the browser or the web page. This is one of the functionalities built in the browser. Accessing the location of the browser, meaning the address of the web page and changing it. Accessing your browsing history, and so on. So hopefully this gave you a simple and clear introduction to JavaScript and the different components that you need to be aware of before diving into the course.